Hello, welcome to Sustainability Origin Story. I am Paul Ravo, the Hillsborough Community College Sustainability Coordinator, and today we're going to be talking about genetically modified organisms. Food is something that is sacred to everybody, and the idea that we would alter it in any way seems to provoke a visceral response. But in reality, humans have consistently and systematically altered plants and animals to enhance their benefit to us. Usually this comes at the expense of the organisms themselves. Because of us, most of our food species are poorly adapted and do not survive without massive amounts of pesticides, fertilizers, and especially our care. You know this because if you pitch a bunch of broccoli seeds into your front yard, you don't exactly have an invasive broccoli problem. It takes decades to select for plants with massive production of larger leaves, better shipping, longer shelf life, stronger color, or huge fruit. But you end up with something very different than you would find in nature. If you ever picked wild strawberries, you know what I mean. Those things are no larger than a marble and a far cry from the 3-biters you can find in any grocery store. Huge strawberries are just an example of what we have artificially created by modifying the genome of the plant. We just did it with old-school genetic technology called selective breeding. Remember, just about everything we eat has been genetically altered in a serious way. Just now we have tools to do it a lot faster. Today we have advanced molecular tools that allow us to move genes around between different species. We can turn genes on, we can turn genes off, we can turn them up or down. It's cheap, it's targeted, and it's fast. The critters we have altered for our benefit using these tools are called genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. Changing the genome of organisms is nothing new for us. We've changed wolves into dogs, mustard greens into broccoli, teosinte into corn, jungle fowl into chickens. Our fingerprints are all over the genome of the critters around us. Some of these critters look almost nothing like their ancient relatives. And what has changed is our ability to move targeted genes from one species to another and do it really fast. There's a huge upside to this. We can move genes from desert plants to improve drought resistance in crops. We can increase the yield of corn or wheat, add genes to produce vitamins in rice, produce their own pesticides. We can even create edible vaccines inside of plants. The possibilities are endless, relatively. You can think of a plant or an animal as a biological computer reading genetic code and performing certain tasks, whatever the code dictates. And now we have the tools to move programs around from different computers into other computers. And this is important because when we think about a growing human population and the speed of climate change, we need all of the tools on the table to be able to adapt our food supply in a time of crisis. The evidence from the scientific community is overwhelming. GMOs are no more dangerous than conventionally grown food. The public, however, seems to think otherwise. It's a political problem, and that's why I invited Eric Fisk to the pod today. He teaches political science here at HEC and incorporates political problems with GMOs into his classes. He also folds in a healthy amount of sustainability topics into his courses, so I'm sure we will hear from him again. If you have any questions or topic ideas for the show, you can always reach us at sustainability@hecfl.edu. Without further ado, here is Eric Fisk. All right, Eric Fisk, welcome to the podcast. So, how did you get all wrapped up into sustainability? What's your origin story?
I would say my origin story starts probably back when I was a teenager. I feel like junior, senior year, I started to sort of become aware of politics and the world around me and things. And I do have to credit that to music. I got into music that really kind of opened my eyes. And Then when I got into undergrad, I hooked up with a couple different organizations that really started to work grassroots on environmental issues and political issues. One of them was the Public Interest Research Group, a PIRG, up there in New York. I'm from New York originally. And so I really started to kind of get into the grassroots, bottom-up kind of movements that were environmental-based, political-based, things like that. So that was sort of my first kind of dipping my toe into the water of environmental issues and sustainability issues. I mean, I don't even think sustainability was a big thing back then as far as a buzzword. And then when I started my PhD program a few years ago, actually it's more than a few years ago now, I was kind of not quite sure where I wanted to go. I did my master's on Cuba and Latin American politics, and that was sort of my area that I was interested in. But I felt like I needed to have something that was a little bit more contemporary, something kind of big issue that was like, what is the issue of my generation? And the first thing that came to mind was climate change. I'm like, you know what? I have to do something about climate change because this is the area that this is going to define like our next 50 years. How do we respond to this? What do we do? And so I decided to kind of shift all of my classes, all of my PhD coursework and papers into climate change. But coming from a political science background in my master's, I did a lot of research on development. And I sort of quickly ran into this personal moral quandary because in development research, you see a lot about like trying to lift people out of poverty. And you read all the statistics about how much poverty there is in the world and how horrible in many cases people are living, the kind of circumstances they're living in. The tools that you're shown to help people out, you're like, yeah, these are going to lift people out of poverty and get them jobs and great homes and running water and education and all these things that people need as human beings. But at the same time, most of the tools and the policies and the programs that were doing this were the ones that were also destroying our environment along the way. And so for a little while, I had sort of a kind of a moral quandary or personal issue. I was like, how do you reconcile these two things? I want to protect the environment for future generations, but I also don't want to ignore all of the poverty and the horrible things that are going on in the world. And that's when I discovered sustainability and sustainable development, this concept of trying to blend the two and merge the two. It's like, can we reimagine these two concepts in a way that we can do both at the same time? And so that was sort of my awakening moment where I went, this is it. And of course, there's lots of controversies around that idea. And my actual PhD and my dissertation is like super, 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 super focused. It's not just about sustainability. When you do that, it's a very specific case study. But I would say that's sort of my ranty, long origin story of sort of how I kind of got into sustainability. And then when I got hired here at Hillsborough Community College full time, everybody sort of kind of carves out as a professor what it is that you're doing besides your classes, besides your coursework. And I thought, you know what, I have to bring my same passion that I had for my dissertation and my research to HEC. And so I found out that we had a sustainability council and that my particular campus didn't have a sustainability committee that was active. And so I said, you know what, this is going to be my thing. This is what I'm going to try to do. And so this is only my second year as a full-time professor, but that means I've got many, many, many decades hopefully ahead of me to make a difference here at HEC.
Nice. Well, welcome to the fray.
Thank you.
You mentioned something about music, kind of like bringing you in early on. I know also you mentioned this idea of like this through line between all your classes, which is also really cool because it really gives you this voice that you can speak from for all your different classes.
Yeah, so the music, I'm going to date myself here to any of the listeners, but the band Rage Against the Machine, it was a mid-90s, late 90s, at the time, I don't know what they would call that kind of music now. It was when rock and rap was starting to kind of merge. And, when you're in high school, you're in your own little world and everything matters and everything's important. But music always kind of struck a chord with me. My parents would always listen to music all day, 24/7 basically. And so even now, music, I never really lost that. The music kind of really matters to me. And so this band talked about, indigenous rights issues and climate change and the global warming and all of these different issues. And I was like, literally just saying it in their songs, not like, kind of metaphorical, abstract way, but just literally talking about these issues. And I went, this is great because I love the music, but I also love that it has a message to it. And so I still actively today in my online Zoom classes, that awkward 5 minutes before class starts and everybody's just kind of standing there and looking at your camera or having your camera off. I show a music video before my class, and I specifically pick songs that deal with social issues and political issues, or have a message to the video as something that my students can listen to and watch that hopefully will get them interested.
That's great. That's a really cool story. I like how music and bands even, they took that message and then now applying it to your classes and stuff, and then basically doing what Rage did to you
that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, that's the whole point.
That's what I'm hoping, yeah. And then you would ask about the through line of my research, I think, of my coursework. And, in grad school, you have a little bit more leeway to do that. But, you have to take all political science classes if you're getting a political science degree. But the professors usually gave me a lot of leeway to sort of take their class in the direction that I wanted to when I did my research and wrote a paper for that class. And so it's still pretty broad, but basically every class, if it was an economics class or political economy, or if it was an ideology class, or if it was a class on citizenship, I would try to incorporate sustainability or this idea of sustainable development into that paper. And it was surprisingly easy, which I think speaks to the interdisciplinary aspect of sustainability, is that it's not just about politics, it's not just about biology, it's not just about economics, it's literally all of these things.
Yeah. Sometimes could be, perceived as a flaw that it is so encompassing that it's almost daunting, that, you look at the mountain of problems and you're just like, oh, no. but I found that, if you do, hiking or mountain climbing or anything like that, when you're driving to the mountain and you're looking at it from the car, it's just terrifying to see that. But then when you get up to the foothills and you just look ahead of you and it's just like, oh, there's this, one step, and then you take another step, and then you look up there and there's a handhold, and you look up there, right. and then all of a sudden, not maybe not all of a sudden, but then you're at the top.
Exactly. That reminds me, there's another similar story in politics that they talk a lot about, the blind men and the elephant, mm-hmm. where there's 6 blind men and they're all touching an elephant, and one of them says, oh, it's very leathery, another one says, oh no, it's very furry, and another one says, oh no, it's sharp and pointy, and they're all at different parts of the elephant. None of them are wrong per se. Their reality is true because they're only seeing part of the picture. And so I think part of sustainability is everybody sort of gets their little chunk, their little part of reality. If they are pushing the needle to make it better in their particular realm, then as a whole, we're kind of pushing up the metaphorical mountain, I guess you could say, towards the top.
You just epitomize the goal of this podcast is to really bring in a diversity of voices to then each describe their own little chunk of the elephant, and then we can all figure out how to move the ball forward.
That sounds great. When you asked me to do this, I saw again on social media, which isn't necessarily the best place to get information, but I see people say things, and then it is sort of a sample of the general public. And I see people talking about GMOs, and then they have a little conversation about natural and unnatural or artificial. And I even, you get to the point where you see people that say, you shouldn't put anything in your body that you can't pronounce, right? That reminds me of an image that I saw, and I wanted to read this out to you. This is a chemical makeup of a common food product. I'm just going to read off some of it. There's only 30 things here, so I don't want to read them off. But these are some ingredients, some chemical ingredients in a common product. Phytotosterols, oxalic acid, butanoate, 3-methylbute, isoleucine, and proline. As a biologist, do you know what that is?
I have no idea.
So that is a banana. So there's an image that goes around social media and some of the groups I follow. It's literally just a banana. And the ingredients, the chemical ingredients in a banana, I can't pronounce. I'm not a Swedish, so I can't pronounce those. And that makes me wonder about this whole idea about this conversation about natural and artificial. And I think you could probably speak better to this because you and understanding biology better. What is natural? What is artificial?
Like you said, I have the same talk with my students. They'll tell me I don't want chemicals in my food, and I will say food is chemicals. So you're probably not eating too much stuff because you can have water is a chemical. So but I understand the gist, right? They don't want to have things that are perceived as unnatural, that could be potentially toxic. I understand the intent, but that word natural just bothers me because it's been basically destroyed by our perceptions of what natural is. Almost all of the food that we eat is actually like it's in an unnatural form. Like, for instance, broccoli. You will never be walking around in the forest and then come upon a patch of wild broccoli because it doesn't exist, right? So, like, and then people think, oh, you go to a farm and a farm is natural, and like having rows and 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 rows of soy or corn or wheat, that is anything but natural. So if you're in a quote unquote like natural environment, it's probably a mixture of critters of all sorts of shapes and sizes, and it's definitely not in rows, but then we organize nature to basically benefit our own needs in a way that's efficient and economical. And so like a farm is just about as unnatural of a place as you can go. You know, all the food that we eat has been optimized through this basically like a process of artificial selection. Like, so you have broccolis and cabbages and Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi and cauliflower and kale. Their ancestor is basically a wild mustard green that we've optimized for our own benefit. So, you know, nothing that we eat is natural.
Right.
So like, and then GM products like genetically modified organisms kind of fall under that umbrella of artificial selection, like that we've purposefully selected certain genes to put into those food products to then do something for us. And there's a whole array of those products.
When I bring it up in my classes, and I tell students that, you know, we've been basically making things unnatural for centuries and centuries, and they realize, oh, okay, the modern banana doesn't look like the old one, or the modern broccoli doesn't look like it did or it didn't exist. But then they're like, but that's not a GMO. And they try to argue that, say that that's not actually GMO, you know, that GMOs are different. That's not what I was talking about. And so I think it is important that before we have any longer conversation about genetically modified organisms, I think that it's important for listeners and us ourselves, just the two of us, to sort of agree, what are we talking about here? Like, what's going to be our working definition of a GMO? Because I think that any kind of sort of intense discussion or conversation or learning time should be, we agree to the ground rules and sort of agree to the definition in first step one, and then we can work on that. And so what do you think is the best definition for a GMO?
You know, genetically modified organism, GMO, is such a loose definition. Inherently, what that really means, you know, thinking about a genetically modified organism, what you are actually referring to is usually a transgenic organism. A transgenic organism means you have reached into the genome of one species, one critter. It could be a microbe, it could be a banana plant, it could be anything, and you plucked out a gene, and a gene codes for a particular protein of interest. It could be something that makes the banana bigger or smaller or disease resistant or heat tolerant or cold tolerant, and you reach in there and you grab that gene and then you plug it into something else. So what you've kind of done is taken two organisms that would otherwise never be able to mash their genomes together, and you as a scientist have mashed them together. So you plucked out a gene from one and you plugged it into another one. And so that's what transgenic means, and I think that's what most people are worried about on some level. And that's what's really kind of interesting, is that we have been eating products that have been fed by transgenic organisms for a really long time now. So we're talking, you know, hundreds of millions of meals of corn or wheat or soy or sugar beets or tomatoes or, you know, you name it. And like the science is super clear that they are no more risky than other conventionally grown crops, but yet the public misinformation persists. So maybe you can kind of talk to that, like, what are the politics of this situation here? Because on the science side, you can look at it and, like, you know, nearly all scientists agree that there are no inherent risk, like as far as for human health. But on the politics side, that seems to not be the case, that there are, you know, bans on genetic modified organisms and, you know.
Yeah, no, so this is one of the things I came across. There was Pew Research is one of the more well-respected polling organizations in America. And they always come out with some really interesting polls. And it's nice because they actually sort of like break down the implications of their polls. And they had one a few years ago about this. And they showed this disparity between the public trust in GMOs and the public knowledge of GMOs versus the scientific community is this gigantic chasm. It's just huge. And there's a little bit of nuance to it that there are, some people say that they have certain issues with the genetic modification themselves. But generally speaking, most people admit they don't really know a lot about them, and yet that they're afraid of them. And so this is sort of this problem that I think it is a little bit on us as scientists, as educators, is that sometimes the best scientists in their field aren't necessarily the best communicators of their field to the general public. And this is where politics comes in, right? Because this is where we have to have some sort of laws and regulations and policies around our food and our food production. And it's not always the scientists that are actually spearheading this or directing this. It's our elected officials. It's the general public. It's the voters. And you would think that in the best type of society that these two things would be as closely as possible, that we would have the best food production, the most efficient food production, the most nutritious food production that's based on the science, but that's not necessarily how it goes. And there's a lot of other aspects to that I think just generally speaking, there is a divide between the science and the general public. That's pretty apparent. How do we fix that? I'm not really sure. We're going to maybe get into that later on.
You haven't solved American politics by now? No.
I haven't solved American politics yet. Okay. Give me a little bit longer, and I think I can work on that. But yeah, part of it is on the consumer side. I think it is on the consumer on some level to be able to do their own research to understand things. But if the information that they're being fed is skewed and distorted and biased, then it becomes very difficult. And so this does kind of speak to a larger conversation about just issues in politics in general. It's like, how do you know that what you're reading is a trusted source? And so this is where I think that scientists and politics should be working more closely together, because there are a lot of really good nonprofits and organizations and public officials or public figures, maybe even celebrities, that are really good at kind of disseminating information, but then they don't have that information, so the scientists can provide them with that. And I think that would be a good partnership. That maybe one little aspect of this that we could work on.
I think we should be kind of going out of our way to explain some of the benefits of this tool and also what we don't know about this tool, because that's how we need to be thinking about genetic modification. Like it's my belief that this era we're living in right now, when we look back maybe in 100 years or whenever, that like we may not be known for like the Trump era or the whatever era, but we might be known for the beginnings of the time where we're able to basically take control of our own genes in some ways. Up until this point, it's been a really hard slog to take a wild mustard, or let's say like teosinte, like basically a weed that produces like 8 kernels of corn, and then grow that thing through selective breeding to then turn into this sugar bomb we call, corn today. And that's basically was done through either like brute force. We've literally zapped plants with radiation to encourage mutations, and then we plant those seeds and just see what happens. Or we've taken, 2 plants that have desired traits and bred them to try to breed those traits into some food that can actually be passed down and passed down and passed down. We've done this with chickens, we've done this with cows, with corn, with all of our food stuff. And genetic modification allows us to do it faster. And speed can be really important when we're trying to address things like climate change. If we have to instill a trait into a plant that makes it more drought resistant or flood resistant, or pest pressures, or change, we cannot rely on selective breeding because it's just not fast enough. When we're talking about food production, I think we need to be explaining to the public just how valuable this tool might be in a changing climate.
Right. I think that people don't realize how ubiquitous GM crops, I guess that these kind of transgenic plants are already. Just real quick, from that poll that I was mentioning about from Pew Research, almost 50% of Americans say, when you ask them, is the food that you eat genetically modified? And 50% of Americans will say none or not much at all. Do you think they actually know what they're talking about?
Well, I mean, depends on what they're eating, I guess, but probably not. Because,
odds are.
Yeah, odds are, considering that most of our calories come from just a few staple crops. So we're talking about corn, wheat, and soy being like some of the major crops, and upwards of 90% of those crops are going to be genetically modified in some way. And then if you're eating cow or pig or chicken or whatever, then those animals are largely fed from those commodity crops. So, and it's not just food too. We change other things. So for instance, if you're diabetic, we have reached into the genome of a human, plucked out the gene for insulin, and then inserted that gene into some bacteria. And now those bacteria do their bacteria thing, but they also produce insulin, and we harvest that insulin, we treat diabetes with it. So, it's like more than just food production, but it's also health. We also produce crops that basically produce their own pesticides. So there are some microbes out there that produce a chemical that basically rots the inside of a grasshopper or a caterpillar, called BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis is the name of the bacteria. It produces this really potent toxin for caterpillars, but it's harmless for people. So you can reach into the genome of that bacteria and then slam it into a corn crop, and now you have a piece of corn that's producing a pesticide. Now, we tend to think, oh, that could be really dangerous, but remember, what's toxic really depends on the dose, and it depends on your perspective, right? Because, for instance, like caffeine is a pretty terrible toxic substance for some pests, but for humans, hey, it's what keeps us going, right?
I'm not addicted. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't need coffee every day.
That's right. I don't wake up and without it I cannot function. Right? And the same thing for dogs. Dogs can get really sick if you give them chocolate, but give it to a human and that makes me happy, right? So
right, and even like apples have arsenic in them, don't they? Like apples have arsenic naturally occurring in them, or like super low levels of things that, in the right amount, might be. But for a human being, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the same sort of premise. So if you put this specific chemical, like this gene that produces this specific chemical, it will kill caterpillars. Well, then that means you're not spraying, because now each individual crop is producing its own pesticide. So that can be a huge environmental win, because you were mentioning earlier with like sustainable development in like maybe developing countries, you might over rely on pesticides, but then you deliver this product and now they can grow crops without that additional expense. And then there's also less spraying in the fields, and that causes less pesticide runoff pollution, so there's a lot of wins that can be derived from GM, and I don't think we give them enough credit. So to me, it's like a big tool. The good or badness, the good versus evil of that tool really relies on how you're using it, like anything else.
Right. It's the difference between a scientist and a mad scientist, right? Like they can be using the same science, the same tool, but what you use it for matters. How you use it. Are you using it and you don't care about the implications of what you're using for, and thus you end up hurting people and hurting the environment? Or do you go into it knowing that this thing can be used for good or be used to help people? And if you do that, I always, argue too with people that, you can have issues with the application of GM crops, GMOs, or maybe some of the legal issues or the economic implications or the political implications, but the science itself, like the thing itself, that's not something that's inherently evil. It's just the thing.
I think you're definitely hitting the right point here. Like the root of that problem might be something more along the lines of gene patenting or some sort of major mergers of seed companies and things like that are the actual root of the problem, and not the advantages that, the production of insulin or the creation of golden rice.
Especially one that I bring up in my classes last year. I feel like it is, if you've never read about GMOs, then it's new, but as soon as you Google GMOs, that's one of the first ones that people talk about. That was one of the first ones that I came across actually in my research years ago, learning about the potential benefits of GMOs. And in less developed countries, especially in urban areas, there's a huge lack oftentimes of fresh fruits and vegetables, which leads to certain mineral and vitamin deficiencies. And obviously in a perfect system, we would be able to distribute fresh fruits and vegetables to everybody everywhere in the entire world. And we can work towards that. But in the meantime, there are kids that are not getting enough of their vitamins and minerals. And I believe for golden rice, it's vitamin A. Is that what I believe? Vitamin A?
Yeah, vitamin A, beta carotene.
Yeah, they're not getting beta carotene. They're not getting enough vitamin A. And by not getting enough vitamin A, it can lead to blindness and other health-related issues. And so one of the great things what they did with the golden rice was they actually, I think it was a daffodil originally, a flower. They were able to take the genes from the flower and put that into the rice, and it changed the color of the rice from, kind of an off-white to a yellow or golden rice. Now that rice that normally doesn't have beta carotene in it does. And in a lot of less developed countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, rice is a staple. It's one of their everyday meals. And so now they can just naturally get enough beta carotene in their diets in less developed countries for a lot of urban areas that they normally wouldn't be able to get. And I think that's a great example of sort of like the potential wins across the board with GMOs, is that you can solve this problem that exists right now that are literally hurting people and making their lives worse. And all we have to do is embrace this one idea. And it doesn't even require you to embrace all GMOs everywhere all the time. But again, if you see the people and how they're using it, what they're using it for, the thing itself, the science itself is not evil. And so if they're using it for something good like this, the potential benefits to humankind are just exponential.
Yeah, especially for kids too, because, the kids with developing bodies run a specific risk for vitamin A deficiency. And, you might have heard carrots are good for your eyes. So it's that orange color that you're kind of looking for vitamin A. And
right, the one that if you eat enough of them, I thought as a kid you could see in the dark, or you could exactly. I thought that if I ate enough carrots.
Yeah. So what is basically happening is you're reaching into the genome of a plant. You're selecting a gene of interest, in this case the one that produces this orange color that's essential for proper eye development, and you're just moving it into the rice. Now that is no different than like eating carrots and rice together, the same exact meal. You're just doing it more efficiently because it could be that carrots can't grow in wherever we're talking about, or, like you said earlier, with fruits and vegetables that are indigenous to that area might no longer be able to be grown there. There's a myriad of different problems, but now you can take this rice that can, solve a major problem like child blindness.
Exactly. Yeah, no, and I think that you just brought up an issue that I think is one of the ones that I try to mention too, because again, I sort of got into this whole thing through the issue of climate change and how, when you get into the climate science, basically from the policy perspective, you have sort of two camps. You have some people that say that we need to try to mitigate global warming, climate change as much as possible. We need to change our behaviors to, lower the global warming effects and everything like that, which you can do. But then there's other people say that we've already passed the threshold in certain points, and we may pass another threshold in the near future. So we need to learn to adapt to the new world, to the new environment. And that's where I think GMOs can play a huge role in the future, because again, food is something we all need. And in the next 50, 100 years, climate change is going to change our local environment pretty drastically in some parts. You're going to have some severe droughts in some parts of the world. You're going to have severe flooding in other parts of the world. And, there's research going on now with plants that can survive those kind of environments. And so we actually can be empowering less developed countries and, poor neighborhoods or poor places in the world to grow their own crops in their own area if we can help them to kind of develop the crops that can survive there, because climate change is changing their ability to grow their own crops. But if we can give them, a wheat or a corn that can survive drought and then come back after months of being, without water, or rice that can be basically submerged underwater for weeks on end, and then once the water rescinds, then the rice is there and it can be harvested. If we can use GMOs to sort of help people adapt to this new reality that we're going to be in the coming decades, that, again, is trying to strike this balance. I think is just the key of sustainability, of helping people now, but also helping people in the future.
Yeah, and we'll link this TED Talk in the show notes, but you shared a really powerful talk with me about how there are some desert plants that can survive lack of water for a long time. They basically dry out, and then when it rains again, they come back. And
right.
that reason why they're able to do that is because of the complement of genes that they have inside of their plant cells. So if we can reach into those genomes and basically hijack their little life hacks for how they're able to survive in the desert, and then incorporate them into tomatoes, then now we have tomatoes that can perhaps survive a month without any water. And we might very well need that power in the future.
Right, because again, I think part of the conversation of sustainability and food production is trying to cut down on carbon emissions and things like that. And transporting of food is one of the big issues. So everybody wants to buy local if it can, but that's not so easy if you don't have arable land. And we're losing arable land as it is because of climate change. And so as far as population goes, part of the conversation is, population is probably going to peak around 10 to 11 billion, depending on who you talk to. But that's 4 or 5 billion more people in the world that we have to feed on less land that we're going to have because we're losing land. So how do you grow more stuff, get more proteins, get more carbs, get more calories on less land? And that's where, like you were saying earlier, we don't really have the time to spend hundreds and hundreds of years crossbreeding to try to maximize our efficiency when it comes to food production. We need to do something different. And this is where I think GMOs can play a huge, huge role.
This era that we're in is just the beginning of even the power of the genome. Like, you can theoretically make a plant do, not anything you want, but given there's some constraints. But let's say we want to take a plant and give it the ability to produce even things like vaccines. That's something that you could potentially do. Increase the protein yield, increase the vitamin yield. Those are all things that you can more or less play with, and we have played with that. I think that kind of comes back to that word natural, is that we have this misconception about what the natural world is and what exactly a natural organism is. And that definition is flimsy at best, because if any digging into that will let you kind of see that humans have had their hands in the genetics of all of our critters for at least 12,000 years, since we really started to grow things, when we stopped hunting and gathering and more or less sat down and started to grow wheat and corn and stuff like that. Even the dog that you have in your house used to be a wolf, right? So, once upon a time, and we just bred wolves that didn't kill us with wolves that didn't kill us, and so on and so on. And then we eventually got a dog you can put in a baby stroller and stroll around on Bayshore or something. So,
I feel attacked right now. I have a miniature dachshund and a chihuahua. So.
There you go. I'm going after you. Yeah, because that thing, a chihuahua is not something that you're going to find in nature, because like an oversized seagull could probably take it down, so I mean, but what does survive in nature is a wolf.
You're right. We do it for a purpose. Sometimes these things are sort of accidental, they crossbreed and, things like that. But a lot of times when we did this artificial selection, it was for a purpose. So I mentioned my miniature dachshund. He was crossbred for a purpose as sort of like a burrower, and he does that still now. He burrows under blankets, but he was bred for a specific purpose, to burrow into, to get weasels and things like that. And that same idea is just what we're talking about with GMOs. We want to create a product, a food that, whatever it might be, that meets a certain need. And we can do that now in an easier way. And part of the problem is that we think that this new way is scary, it seems different. And so, because it's transgenic, because it's done, quote unquote, in a lab, it's bad. And so, and I think part of that is just a misunderstanding. And so, one of my hopes was, from doing this podcast, was, over the multiple podcasts, is to, try to hook people a little bit and say, what you think you may not actually know. And maybe you should go, we'll help direct you in some reliable sources, but, do some research on your own too. But you'll come to realize that a lot of the things that you might have heard or read about GMOs, maybe not the most reliable or accurate.
And I love that you brought up the quote unquote in a lab, where because that I think you're really getting to some of the root of the problem here, that we have this idea that a farm is natural and a lab is unnatural. And I mean, I would beg you to go into a McDonald's, right? And then look behind the counter and tell me that process is natural. Watch a video on how a hot dog is made, and then tell me that is a natural food.
Oh, no.
A lot of our food that we consume on a regular basis, potato chips, all of these things are like frankly built in a lab or some sort of factory food production type of system that is inherently unnatural. So I think we're just living in a world that humans have largely cultivated, and we just need to accept that and then think about the tools that we have at our disposal to combat things like poverty, food insecurity, climate change. And GM give us the best tools to move toward those goals.
Right. But actually, that reminds me of another issue that I'm hoping that we'll be able to cover at some point is why, people used to grow food to consume food. Like you would have your little plot of land or, in your little community, you'd have somebody that would grow a lot of the food. But that shifted over the last couple hundred years. And, even though we still grow food to eat, obviously, the food that's grown is grown by a business, a corporation, whether it be small business, big business, whatever it might be. And at the end of the day, a business is only a business if it's making money. And so, I think this is going to be part of the conversation that we have to have too, is sustainable food production. What does that look like? Is it going to be bigger corporations owning bigger plots of land so that they can, maximize their profits and then lower costs? Or is it smaller plots of land or smaller local farms? Where does that fit into this conversation? Because, we've definitely changed the way that we view food and produce food. And part of that is that we now make it for a profit, and it's sold on the market, like cars and computers and things like that, except that we don't need cars and computers to survive. We need food to survive. And I think that's a key part of this conversation.
Yeah, that's really important. It could be that we prize efficiency above all else and kind of with that profitability, because the system that you're describing where basically one farmer is feeding hundreds of Americans or hundreds of people around the world, whereas maybe the time that you're describing, kind of a before time when food was grown by you, maybe it was one person fed two people or three people. And now we've made this huge mechanized system where we're largely dependent on 3 or 4 major cereal crops for, 90% of our calories or something close to that. Yeah, we really just prize the efficiency, and there maybe can be some good that's derived from that. Like, we no longer have to farm to get food. You can do another job that then you can exchange for for a food thing. So not everybody has to be a farmer, but I'd be one to advocate for a more localized food source for a few reasons. One is just the sustainability of the system overall. If you have a few major disruptions, we were talking about bananas earlier, but if you've eaten a banana and and someone else has eaten banana, you're basically eating the same exact banana. They're all basically clones of each other. So in a model like that, we have if a single bacteria or fungus or virus can get into one of those bananas, it can get into all of them. So having a system that's built on a few major agribusinesses around just a few different crops, if any of those crops fail or that region fails, we're going to be in big trouble. So I would be one to advocate for more of a localized food system. You cut down on transportation costs. You potentially have a little bit more inefficient system, but the exchange might be worth it.
Right, because that basically would be like the potato famine, right? Or the papayas went through a whole infection or bacteria that went through them too, and GMOs potentially help solve that or curb that issue.
Yeah, bananas have recently gone through that issue. I know that the bananas that we're eating now is the only commercially viable bananas that are available. So there are dozens of different types of bananas you can eat that are out there. But the one that we have now is I believe the Cavendish variety, and it is the only one that's long and yellow when you eat it. So it's a consumer choice banana. So like for instance, some bananas get really spotty when they're ripe, and consumers won't buy that. So it needs to be a big banana, it needs to turn bright yellow when it's ripe, and then maybe get spotty. And back in the day, there was a banana called the Gros Michel, and then that banana, because it was a giant monoculture, was infected by a fungus, I believe, and then that whole monoculture fell apart, and then now we're down to our last banana species. So this banana, the one that we're eating now, is actually not the most flavorful banana, but it's the most profitable one because consumers will buy it because it's big and yellow. So there are smaller, stumpier, maybe browner bananas that are out there, but they just don't sell as well. So we kind of built this kind of very crazy system where the food that's available is not merit-based food that delivers the highest nutrition for the cheapest land use or smallest water consumption. It's just kind of like whatever the consumers will buy thanks to excessive marketing. It's really interesting. Like, out of all the thousands and thousands of species of things that are out there to consume, we eat 12. I think it's like crazy how small of a number, just insane.
Right. Just, you go down the aisles and, if you actually look at the ingredients of most of the food in the middle aisles of any grocery store, right, they're probably like 10 ingredients that repeat in different forms, but it's the same original 10 ingredients, just in different forms and different shapes and different, ways of being cooked and baked and prepared and all that kind of stuff. And so the illusion of diversity and choice, right? We think that we have lots of choices because it seems like we have lots of choices, but if you trace it all the way back, it's actually not as diverse as we think it is.
And that's I think, is one of the major flaws in our current system is, I think it's 4 major cereal crops. So it's maize, like corn, wheat, soy, and rice, combined to create, I think, 90% of the calories that are consumed on the planet. So it's just unfathomable that, like, if we're growing this huge monoculture of corn in Nebraska, it's all pretty much the same corn. And if one disease happens to find its way into that corn, that wipes out a quarter of our major cereal crops. And that can definitely happen. And one of the ways we could potentially fight against that would be something like a GM type of corn that could produce a chemical or resistance in some way. And we can do that almost overnight if we have to. And to take that power away from us just seems not to be a great idea, because we'll never be able to selectively breed that resistance back in time to avoid something like a potato famine like you were talking about.
Right. So the GMOs can fill that void of, letting us adapt to the things that are happening in the world, or even make things more local. As I said, like, maybe we could grow corn in an area that could never grow corn before, because they can modify a particular strain of corn so that it can grow in that environment or that area, and allows them then to grow it, and they don't have to rely on a Nebraska cornfield if something bad were to happen. So I think there's a couple different angles that GM crops can sort of play into sort of helping us diversify our food source, also in like the actual food itself, but then diversifying your locality, where we get it from, which is, again, both part of this conversation of sustainability and sort of looking towards the future.
Yeah. So now that we've covered a lot of the pros of GM products, foods and medicines and, basically pesticides or deterrents, what would you think some of the downsides of GM technology might be?
Yes, I think we kind of touched on this at the beginning, when we first started our conversation, how, the science is essentially settled. I mean, obviously science is never 100% settled, because that's why it's science. It's always open to adaptation and to new ideas and to being revised. But as of right now, the consensus among people that understand GMOs is that they are safe for humans, they're safe for the environment. But the controversy around a lot of it, I think, then, is the Monsanto effect. It's the politics, it's the economics of it. And this sort of there's a good segue, I think, from our previous conversation about monocultures and the businesses that own the land and are growing the food. It's not to the point now where they just own the land and the food, but corporations that own the seeds themselves, right? And so if they're the only game in town, so to speak, for that one particular GM seed that will survive in your area, either because of, some sort of disease or blight or something like that, or because of the environment, as a farmer, as a local farmer, even a middle range farmer, you're stuck. You have to go to that particular thing. And I think that sort of strikes people as sort of, whether you're pro-capitalist, pro-market or not, like having that sort of constraints on you is not great. And particularly because we're talking about food, it's not the same market as if we're talking about cars or if we're talking about iPhones or things like that. Like we're talking about food production. We're talking about things that people have to survive. And so I think a lot of the controversy is around the politics, the economics of it. And that's where people, I think, have a real problem. And I think that is a worthwhile conversation to have.
Yeah, I almost think that like the politics side here, I think, is maybe the most troubling. The way we've designed our system with patents on things that can auto-replicate, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we kind of see this overall merger in all the seed companies who own the patents on the genes in the seeds. They also own the chemicals, the fertilizers, the pesticides, all those things to be able to manage weeds or pests or encourage the growth of the plants. And they all are owned by the same company. And we kind of see that these mergers have merged, which have merged, and now, you see just a handful of companies owning more than half of all the seed sales in the world. And that can be a big problem because, like you were saying, it's an inelastic market. Like food, you have to eat. It's not the newest iPhone. So you must buy it or make it somehow. If a few of these companies have a stranglehold on that market, that can be really bad for any system, really.
Right. No, and actually, it reminds me of a similar case, a media in America. I think it was something like back in the 1980s, there was something like almost 100 different companies that owned 90% of the media in America. And today there's 5. And so the media that you're consuming is controlled by fewer and fewer. And so obviously you can see there's some political implications for that. And, I think the problem that a lot of people have is they just think that the way that we structure our economic system, the way that we structure patent law, the way that we structure our regulations, the way that we structure everything is just natural. Like they sort of think that everything is just a free market. It is all dictated by supply and demand, but that's not true and it's never been true. There's been governments basically forever and they get to decide how do we deal with this whole issue of patent laws? Like that's a law. And so as a voter, as a citizen, you have the ability to influence that. Like if you think that, a corporation should be able to patent food and a seed and a GM food and seed, then you can vote that way. You can vote for people that support that. You can vote in support of laws that do that. If you don't think that that's good though, you have the ability to change that. So I think that on the same way that we sort of take things for granted and take things at face value from a scientific perspective, people do that same thing when it comes to the economics. We just assume that that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about it, but really it's not. We create the political, legal, and economic environment that our food production exists in, and we have a chance to shift that in whatever direction we want. And yeah, I think there's definitely some issues with it right now that need to be resolved, or else they may not be sustainable for us in the near future.
Yeah, I think it's often the case that technology moves a lot faster than the law.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Did you see any of the recent hearings in Congress about social media? And they had like Zuckerberg and Facebook people up there and Twitter, and like the people in Congress, they're behind the times. And this is where again the partnership between science and researchers and public officials and voters and citizens needs to be stronger, because when you have that huge disconnect, you have people that are like, they pull out their phone in a committee hearing and they're like, Mr. Zuckerberg, why can't you just do this on Twitter? And he's like, because I own Facebook. Like, and that's how oblivious they are. And then that same thing happens in food production and in GM science, is that there's such a disconnect between our elected officials, our citizens, our voters, and then the science and the scientific community. And that has having some pretty serious repercussions all over the place.
And it's a self-reinforcing cycle, right? So if you get a bunch of, let's say, patents for certain food products, and then you also own the chemicals to treat, let's say, the pests to go with that corn or that then farmers, and then the farmers then are, reliant on you to provide those seeds. So you kind of have a monopoly on those crops. And I mean, there needs to be a structural shift in order for, the system to kind of wind itself down on some level, because the ratchet effect has really pushed us to this brink, especially when it comes to food production.
Yeah, they actually in policy making lingo, they call it the iron triangle. That in Congress and in lobbying, that basically you have the Congress, you have the committees in Congress, you have the bureaucracy in the executive branch, and then you have the interest groups. And those three things basically make policy in America. And the problem is that when I talk to students about that, they're like, "So where do people come in?" And I'm like, "Well, they don't." And they're like twice removed, because the only part of your saying that is just Congress. But Congress has become so specified with committees and subcommittees that most policies being made, and most Americans aren't even aware of any of that policy. And so when you ask somebody, they want to change it, and they go, "Well, how do I change it?" It's an iron triangle for a reason. They call it iron for a reason. It's not easy to change. And so that is a whole other conversation, but that gets into more of my realm of like social movements and social change. And I think that that's another part of this too, is that yes, there's a science, and yes, there's food production, and we're talking about GMOs, but a lot of this, needs to change, needs to be fixed in many ways. But the process to fix that is inherently political and brings with it all sorts of issues and complexities that I'd have like a 45-minute rant just for that. So,
yeah, I think all of us probably could at this point. Yeah, I really like what you're saying. It almost is inspiring democratic reforms before food reforms, because what you're saying is there's a structural flaw in the system with the iron triangle. You must first break that triangle in order to get the policy that, let's say, the people want first.
Right, exactly, yeah, and this is where people don't realize the power that they have, and that's even though we, as the system was, our one kind of angle is Congress, that doesn't mean that you have the power to then change the people in Congress, and so you can vote for elected officials that are pro-science, that believe in the things that you want them to believe in, and you have the power to vote against people that don't, and even from the product perspective, you vote with your wallet, you have the ability to say, no, I don't want to buy your product because of X, Y, Z. And so I think that as a citizen, and it's not you as an individual, and this is where I get, a lot of students get defeated. A lot of people I talk to feel defeated. They say, I'm one person. What am I going to do? I can't change anything. If me not buying X product is not going to change them, me voting for one politician, one elected official is not going to change anything. To which I say, well, on some level, you're right, and that's kind of the reality of it. But that's not the point. The point is that in a democracy like ours, in a pluralistic society, you are part of something bigger. There are movements out there. There are organizations, nonprofits that are pushing the needle on the issues that you care about. And so what you do is you add your votes, you add your voice, you add your wallet to those movements that are bigger than yourself. And so you link up with them. And so we tend to think we have to do everything by ourselves. Everything's individual based in America. But that's not really how the most major changes have ever come in our history. They've been when individuals come together as a group and then push for change. You're going to win some and you're going to lose some. But the idea is that, just because something may never happen, you may never get to that 100% end goal that you want to see happen, doesn't mean that the fight's not worth fighting, right? It doesn't mean that the social movement or the movement that you're part of is not worth being part of, because every little step along that way, working towards that goal, is worthwhile, because you're making the world a better place. You're making your country, you're making your neighborhood, you're making your life a better place. So it may take a while, and it may seem like it's a long, slow slog, but it is worth it in the end.
I think of that back to like mountain climbing or whatever. If you just love standing on the tops of mountains, you're not going to survive mountain climbing because a majority of the time that you're climbing mountains is either like you are climbing the mountain. You're not standing on the top. And if the goal of what you're doing is just to stand on the top, you're going to kind of fail out of the system. It's so hard. You have to enjoy, I know it sounds so crazy, but you kind of have to enjoy the fight, right? I mean, with the goal in mind. Like, the goal, of course, is to stand on the top, but you have to find beauty in that struggle, and you have to like love the fight, or else you'll never get there.
Right. And you're not by yourself. I think that people, like I said, people tend to think that they're, I'm the only person in the world that cares about this, or I'm the only person in my neighborhood that cares about this issue in my town or city. But honestly, odds are that's not true. Odds are there's probably dozens, hundreds, if not thousands of people that care about that same thing that you do. And that's honestly, that's how I end my classes every semester. I say you don't have to care about and work on trying to fix every issue because it's overwhelming. There are so many problems in the world, and that's understandable. But pick your one or two or three things and make them yours. Like, make that your issue. And then if everybody in the world did that, everybody in our country, everybody in your neighborhood picked their one or two or three issues that they care passionately about and tried to push that needle to make it better, and everybody just did their one thing, that's okay, because then as a whole, things will be getting slowly better and better and better and better and better. The idea is, I think that people have to make that first initial sort of like decision to say, this is my thing, this is how I'm going to try to push the needle, and I'm going to do it. And that is kind of overwhelming, but that is part of the conversation.
Well, I think it's a really inspiring point to close. So, Eric Fisk, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Eric, for joining me today. Thank you, Stefan Kugaruga, for the music design, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions, suggestions for topics or guests, please email me at sustainability@hecfl.edu. Take care, everybody.